thing about what families are being delivered through the tax system, the childcare system, and some of these income support payments.
OK, I'm actually going to go to a question that did come to us earlier from one of our members of the audience, and it's David Wayne. David Wayne, where are you? There's David.
Oh. Prime Minister quotes political dynamite, Bob Hawke, by 1990.
You've already got me worried.
Australian children by 1990 will not be living in poverty. Paul Keating, the recession we had to have. And John Howard, Australian working families have never had it so good. Today, you said there's nothing more that you could do. Did you light the fuse? OK,
let me just explain this to some of our audience members and people out there who might not know exactly what you're talking about. This is a reference to a quote.
Including me, actually. So.
OK. This is a reference, evidently in reference to the quote from you today, where you said, we've done as much as we physically can to provide additional help to the family budget, recognising the cost of everything is still going through the roof. As much as we physically can is, I guess, what you're being called out on here. Oh. Is that one of those things that's going to follow you around for a very long time?
No, I'm just referring to the budget we've just delivered. I mean, that has to be set against the economic circumstances of Australia today, the pressures, financial pressures which families are under today, as well as honouring our pre-election commitments. Taking all those factors into account, you know, I stand by what I said today. That's as reasonable an outcome as we could deliver within the budget disciplines we had to adhere to. Because you know what's overall necessary in macroeconomic terms, and that is to make sure we've got a responsible budget which puts downward pressure on inflation, downward pressure on interest rates. You do that, it means producing in our current economic circumstances a sizable surplus. And on top of that, honour your pre-election commitments to families to make sure you're doing something on tax, you're doing something on childcare tax rebate, you're doing something on education tax rebates. So within the current budget, you're right. For the future, each budget will be adjusted accordingly.
Well, David, do you want to respond to that?
Well, it seems as though we're talking about the previous government, the Howard government. They weren't doing enough. The inflation genie was out of the bottle. World crude oil prices, the grocery prices that you were going to set up a price watch. Is it not that the government really doesn't have control of that? And well, the Howard government, the same situation was going to occur with your government.
There are things within government that you do have direct purchase over. One's the tax system, one is the payment system when it comes to childcare.
True.
Additional payments when, for example, we've introduced this education tax refund. Also, what you can do in terms of housing policy. We've introduced something in the order of $1.5 to $2 billion of initiatives to assist people with saving for your first home, building more affordable rental accommodation. Those things that you can do something about. But when it comes to things that you do not have direct control over, obviously in terms of the global price of oil, then what you can do is simply act in these other areas to make sure that there are some more dollars to draw upon in terms of the family budget. But as I've said consistently, both before the election and since, there are no silver bullets in this business. The key thing is to do what you can.
I'm just going to just bring you up on that. If you can't do anything about the global price of oil, what do you say to Brendan Nelson when he says you can do something here? You can actually lower the price of petrol by taking it off the excise. And he says you're just looking at petrol prices. You can actually lower it by losing a tax.
Well, is that the Nelson position or the Turnbull position?
We'll stick with the current leader.
Well, seriously, I mean, it is all over the place. Apart from those two positions, there's the bloke who's now designing their new tax policy who says that the current excise arrangements are just fine and dandy. So I'm not quite sure where they stand. We believe that the responsible course of action is how do you maximise competition policy pressure on the oil majors? That's why for the first time in this country's history we have a petrol price commissioner. That's why by year's end we'll have a system adopted nationally, which has been in WA, introduced actually by a state Liberal government back in the year 2000, called National Fuel Watch, which means that on the day before you have posted petrol prices for every petrol station in the country so that you know where it's going to be the next day, rather than petrol prices shifting 1,000 times during the day, often exploitatively. Now, these, as I said, don't add up to a silver bullet. Do they help at the margins? Do they help a bit more than that? We hope so. But we also concentrate on those other family budget questions that we referred to before.
All right, there's a lady down the front here who's been trying to get a question to you. I'll just get the microphone over to her. There you go.
Mr Prime Minister, surely this latest hike in fuel prices is a good reminder that part of the long-term policy planning should include real alternatives for sustainable transport use, not just transport of goods, but also individual transport modes. If the federal government could take a lead in this, I know that the state government has a large control over this sort of area, but certainly if the federal government could show the way and help to coordinate something like this.
You're talking about urban transport?
Urban transport.
Well, let me just point to a basic contrast here. We've just brought down a budget, which, you know, some people have criticised, and that's their democratic right, and that's the good thing about this country. But one of the things that's been criticised by our opponents and others is the establishment of Infrastructure Australia, and for the first time in the country's history, a Building Australia fund so that the national government also takes the lead in the provision of critical infrastructure in road, rail, port, and the new infrastructure of the 21st century, high-speed broadband. One of the big infrastructure needs goes to the very, very huge challenge which people are facing each day, which is just urban congestion. That's one thing. And people say, well, I wouldn't be in my car if I had a decent mass transit system to get from A to B. Okay? Sydney, where we are tonight. Sydney, where we are tonight, that's big. I was in Melbourne sometime this morning. I was in Adelaide in between times. But, can I say, most people in urban Australia are saying we have real problems here. What we have committed is funding for feasibility studies this year for elements of a metro system here in Sydney and elements of a metro system in Melbourne. It's got to pass the cost-benefit analysis test, but our opponents say this is some sort of rinky-dink fund that we've established. I actually go around Australia and people say, I want an urban transport system that works, and will the national government become partners with state governments and others to try and make it work?
Okay. I just want to pick you up on this inflation question, because you've acknowledged that you can't do anything about global oil prices. Global oil prices are feeding into inflation. You'll be aware there's
not invading Iraq would have helped.
Indeed.
No, it's a factor. It's a factor. It's a factor in terms of the global supply of oil.
Can I just make the point that the Nobel Prize-winning economist Joe Stiglitz, who also says that invading Iraq was a big problem, says now that reserve banks like ours, which are targeting inflation by raising interest rates, are making a fatal error when the inflation is imported. That means you're importing the fuel, the cost is going up, it's feeding into your inflation. Now, the former Liberal leader, John Hewson, said a similar thing. He said inflation is in price increases that are beyond the control of the Reserve Bank. And yet, the Reserve Bank is inevitably, we believe, going to keep raising interest rates to control inflation. Should they continue to do that, even though the problem is coming from outside?
Well, let's go to the inflation question itself. Inflation is generated by a whole series of factors, one of which is whether you've got budget policy under control, whether you've got a decent fiscal surplus in our current circumstances or not. That's one. Second is, do you have real problems on the supply side of the economy? In other words, have you got enough skilled labour? Have you got enough infrastructure, which we've just been talking about? Answer to both those questions, no, which is why you have inflationary pressures in the economy as well. What's another reason? Well, obviously you've got cost pressures particularly arising through what's happening in the energy sector and the food sector worldwide, not just here.
Which are related to each other.
Which are related to each other and also related to water shortages. And as you know, in politics, everything else, most things are related. So you've got that factor, as well as in Australia's case, we have extraordinary terms of trade because of the price being attached to our energy exports. All these factors have an impact on inflation. But you cannot at the same time, therefore, conclude that inflation is not, therefore, a problem which warrants action. If you let that one go, if you let it go, and We, as we inherited government 5 or 6 months ago, inherited the highest level of inflation this country's seen in